Good evening. I'm Sergeant Major Dan Sebby. I'm the Director of Military History and Museums for the California Military Department. I oversee 3 museums, not only here, but at Camp Roberts and at the Joint Forces Base in Los Alamitos. We're going to talk about the California National Guard and the California Military Department. The National Guard of California is the oldest public institution in the state, predates statehood, when a militia company was formed in San Francisco by the military government of California in 1849. 1 year before the military department and 1 year before statehood. So that unit, the 1st California Guard, was incorporated into the military department in 1850. So that makes us one of, if not the only, public institution in California that predates statehood. We have a very rich military history. California is the only state that had a 5-star general serve in its militia or National Guard. So who could it be? After the Civil War, 3 people were picked to be General of the Army. Ulysses S. Grant, Phil Sheridan, and William Tecumseh Sherman, who served in the California militia in the 1850s. Who were the first people killed in the attack of Pearl Harbor? 3 members of Battery F, 251st Coast Artillery from Long Beach, who had gotten up early on December 7th, rented an airplane to fly around Oahu. The Japanese hadn't even made land yet. The liberator of Korea was a Sacramento dentist by the name of Roy Green, commanding the Sacramento Valley's 184th Infantry Regiment, headquartered before the war at the old 12th and W Armory. He led the regiment through several amphibious landings, including the very successful landing on Kwajalein. And he was selected by the commander of the 7th Infantry Division to take the Japanese surrender for South Korea and became the first military governor of the occupation. So the liberator of South Korea was a Sacramento dentist. And it goes on. There's stories like that throughout our history. So we're going to talk about antebellum California, the California militia, which was the name of the state's militia from 1850 to 1866. And the first one, again, was the 1st California Guard. And all these units had very ornate membership certificates. They were almost like an armed version of the Elks Club. This is the San Francisco Hussars, and a lot of them were ethnic units. So when you see the term Hussars, whether it be San Francisco or Sacramento, you'll probably find a tie to the local Turnverein Hall, because these were mostly ethnic Germans and Hungarians. And one of the missions of the militia was making sure hangings went off well, because usually the police departments and sheriff's department were really small, and usually the guy getting hung had a lot of friends. And that's the last thing you want to do, is have a bad hanging. So something about having 100 guys out there with fixed bayonets kinds to dissuade the people. Again, a lot of units were ethnic. There was actually an Irish regiment. So this is the Emmett Guard. It's hand colorized, so you can see the green facings on his cuffs, his collar, and the top of the pom-pom on his shako. There was also a German regiment and individual companies. There was a French-speaking one. So there was ethnic regiments besides being the typical Anglo regiment. And again, another membership of the Marion Rifles. Some of these units followed British traditions or French traditions. These guys were dressed in green, following the British tradition of uniforming their rifle units in green. In the Napoleonic era, those were the special forces of the time. So California in the Civil War. If you ask the average Californian, did California participate in the Civil War, they'll say no. One thing, we provided a lot of money for the Civil War, and we're the only state that has not been reimbursed for its Civil War bonds. We tried about 20 years ago, and it got shot down. California, first of all, 3 names for you, for how many people are interested in Civil War history? Raise your hands. I'm going to give you 3 names of Californians who led Californians in the Civil War. Obviously, I already mentioned William Tecumseh Sherman, who introduced urban renewal to Georgia. The other one was Henry Halleck, who wrote the Constitution of California in the military government. He collected all the Spanish and Mexican papers, had them copied, which is the basis of the Bancroft Library. The originals were lost in the earthquake, but the copies survived and is the basis of the Bancroft Library at the University of California. He was commanding general of the U.S. Army between Winfield Scott and Ulysses S. Grant. The last and probably the most infamous of the three, Joseph Hooker. Who shall go in infamy about a certain letter about women passing through the lines and how the term became a derogatory term. He was from Sonoma. If you go to Sonoma, there's the Hooker House. I know, it's really tough not to laugh when you hear the Hooker House. But he commanded the Army of the Potomac at the Battle of Chancellorsville. So California not only had leadership running the Civil War for the Union and paying for it, but they also the California Volunteers also relieved all the federal garrisons west of the Rockies. Now, there was a threat. There was a Texas column that marched out of Fort Bliss, Texas, heading for Los Angeles because the blockade was strangling the South, and I think they really wanted a West Coast port where the Union Navy was like 5 ships. They met the California column, the scouting parties from the Texas column and the California column met at a place called Pacheco Pass in Arizona. Texans, being who they are, reported back there's thousands of Yankees headed this way. Well, actually there were. But the skirmish was only the 2 scouting parties. And that was it. They turned around and started heading back to Texas. Well, when they came out, they weren't the friendliest people toward the Native Americans, and they had to fight their way not only through the Union volunteers, but also the Native American tribes. So they made it back to, eventually back to Fort Bliss. California, unfortunately, was the only Union state where a militia unit went south. The Los Angeles Mounted Rifles, commanded by the sheriff of Los Angeles County, was Albert Sidney Johnson's escort when he accepted his Confederate commission. They escorted him to Fort Bliss. The person who kept other units from, because Los Angeles was a hotbed of pro-Confederacy, the person who stopped that, who was a militia brigadier general by the name of Andreas Pico. That, for those of you who know California history, that name should be very familiar to you. His brother was the last Mexican governor of California. He defeated the U.S. Dragoons at the Battle of San Pascal in Southern California. And when he became an American citizen, he became the quintessential Californiano, born in Spanish rule, served the Mexican nation, and then went on to serve the American nation. He also formed one of 2 Lancer regiments in the Union Army, the other one being Rush's Lancers from New Jersey and the 1st California Native Cavalry in California. So did California participate? Most certainly. We secured the West from Confederate expansion, relieved federal garrisons, secured the ports on the West Coast. The bad side, there were atrocities against the Native Americans in Idaho. And some of that is still, you can still find that history at our counterpart museum in Utah, at Fort Douglas. Their whole Civil War exhibit is nothing but the California Volunteers in Utah. They were sent there to keep an eye on the Mormons. So there was a lot of intrigue going on. At one point, you had spies from one Union California Volunteer Regiment being provocateurs, and it was getting picked up by spies from another California Volunteer Regiment. So they were reporting spy actions between the 2 regiments, and there was no spy. So here we have the Hayward Guard. They're looking pretty smart there with their muskets. This is the Union Boy, the Sacramento Light Artillery. For those of you who know Old Sac, that is down on 2nd Street. And then here they are again at Plaza Park. I think that Plaza Park is the park in front of the City Hall. Every time there was a Union victory between 1863 and 1865, they'd go take this cannon out and fire a salute. Pissed the Confederate sympathizers off to no end. The San Jose Guard of the militia, there was actually a unit called the National Guard before the National Guard was called the National Guard. And there was like one in Los Angeles, one in San Jose, one in San Francisco. This was a unit that was socially prominent. They built their own armory on Post Street on Union Square. All the armories were destroyed in 1906, which a lot of our history went up in smoke, literally. But it was a very socially prominent unit. And here's probably the worst duty for the California Volunteers. You are with the Santa Catalina Island Garrison, one company out there. What are you going to do if the Confederate Navy shows up and starts shelling you, or the privateers? Yeah, there's no way it's the place to run. And it's boring. You sure there's maybe a bar, and that's about it. Okay, so one of the units that I love to poke in the bear in Massachusetts, Massachusetts having a hard time filling its quota for cavalry. So they said, hey, California, you're the only state that hasn't instituted a conscription. You got plenty of volunteers. How about sending those volunteers back to Massachusetts? We'll pay their way. And so 5 companies of the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry were grouped to be called the California Cavalry Battalion. And they fought at Gettysburg, Appomattox, all the major cavalry battles in the second half of the Civil War that the Army of the Potomac fought in. So at the end of the war, because it turns out that more than 50% of this Massachusetts unit were Californians. Guess who got the credit for the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry? California. We have the guidon for the California 100, Company A. We have the battalion standard for the regimental standard. We have the regimental color stored at the State Archives. They're so fragile, they'll probably never see an exhibit again. And every couple of years, I get a phone call from my counterpart in Massachusetts, who is a retired brigadier general. Dan, can we get the stuff from the 2nd Mass back in Massachusetts? To which I reply, the last time I looked at the regimental standard, it's the Great Seal of the state of California that says Eureka, not the Great Seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Well, he says it's on the other side. How do we know? Because when the state Senate paid to have them stitched down to muslin, nobody took a picture of the opposite side. So evidence says it's a California flag and we're keeping it. This has got to be the longest running joke of my life. It's been going on since 2007. This general calls me, can we have it back? No. It's all, he knows that he's not getting it back. Okay, 3rd California Infantry formed in Stockton. This was the unit that garrisoned Camp Douglas, later Fort Douglas in Salt Lake City. Again, you can go to my Utah National Guards Museum and you see a lot about the 3rd California. In 1866, the militia was renamed the National Guard of California. It was a Democratic governorship came in, and they looked at the militia as being a Republican institution, so they cut it in half. So force structure cuts are nothing new to us. Here we have a musician with the Auburn Grays. Music played a lot in the military at this time. Anyone know why? Communications, bugle calls, drum beats. Infantry regiments, they usually had their own bugle calls per regiment, so no one, the 35th New York wouldn't charge when the 1st Illinois sounded their charge. So they had different musician for each regiment. Okay, this is my favorite picture. This is the Sacramento Hussars in front of the Sutter Rifles Armory, which is the Pacific Stables in Old Sac. And I lived That's the Clarendon House, and I lived in that apartment. That's the Eagle Room of the Firehouse Restaurant. And that is Francis Ebner Hotel in Old Sac. So this is about a 20-year-old painting, but it gives you an idea. Again, close ties to the Turnverein, German-speaking. They're wearing the Hungarian Hussar uniform. I would really love to find one of those uniforms. Somewhere, I'm thinking in some old attic. So they had a camp training area at the De La Vega range in Santa Cruz. And I think we still own a part of this, the old Santa Cruz Armory. The golf course, this is now the golf course in Santa Cruz. I remember during Loma Prieta, we had more trucks than we could park at the Armory, so they said park it on the golf course, we own it. But this is the Light Battery B, the first guard unit in the state, firing their cannons at De La Vega Park. This is the architectural rendering of the Ellis Street Armory, circa 1893. It would last less than 12 years because of the earthquake. It was actually, we have the pictures of them building. It's solid stone. No, it's not a facade, it's stone. It was a gorgeous building. And we got pictures of the interiors of some of these armories. That was very Victorian and very ornate because there was a social aspect to being a member of the militia and the National Guard. And they didn't do weekends. They did like every Tuesday night. And a lot of guys joined to get one night out of the house. Okay, here we have Sacramento's Troop B, 1st California Cavalry Battalion. We found some pictures recently showing them at the baseball field where Target is. There was a period of about 4 years that there was no baseball team there. It was called Buffalo Park. This troop, at that later California Cavalry Squadron, would take their horses over to the baseball diamond and have saber drills, horsemanship training, small unit tactics, and then take their horses back to the 12th and W Armory. 7th Regiment, Los Angeles' own, now the 160th Infantry. Another famous unit, another socially prominent unit. Spanish-American War. The 1st California Infantry Regiment, a National Guard unit in San Francisco, instead of having 5 infantry regiments as they had during the Civil War, is now down to 1 infantry regiment of about 1,400 men. Plus there were some units that had changed over to artillery. But this unit volunteered en masse to fight in the Philippines. They fought in the First Battle of Manila. The 2 most famous members were their chaplains. They're the only chaplains in the history of the United States Army that had facilities named after them that weren't chapels. There is an artillery battery, Coast Artillery Battery at Fort Winfield Scott on the Presidio that had a battery named for one of the chaplains. The other one was named after Chaplain McQuaid, which is Camp McQuaid in Watsonville. That was formed for the summer camps for the Coast Artillery Unit in San Francisco. They drug all their 155 millimeter guns down there, fired them off, made the neighbors mad, blew out windows, basically having a really good time for artillerymen. Trust me, those guys, they like doing that stuff. And that became the Coast Artillery Replacement Training Center at the beginning of World War II. But again, the only 2 chaplains to have training installations and tactical an installation named for them were from the 1st California. This is Union Square. This is the 1st California Infantry Regiment being inducted into federal service. They trained at the Presidio a short while and then went to the Philippines. There was also an artillery battery that went with them. This battalion had 3 battalions, but they only took 1 battery with them to be their supporting artillery. And here they are marching out of the Presidio to the docks. And those things across their chest, that's their bedrolls. They didn't really have rucksacks like we have today. The San Francisco Earthquake and Fire. Here we have Company C, 1st California Infantry Regiment formed up on the streets. You can see that you've got the buglers here. Again, bugles used for communications. All the armories were destroyed. And we lost most of our history about the California volunteers and the militia were destroyed too. A lot of the history of us in the Philippines was destroyed. The only reason the battle flags survived, all the Civil War battle flags, all the Spanish-American War battle flags, was because they were on display in the rotunda of the state capitol. That is the only reason. And I watch eBay like a hawk. If I see anything that's pre-1906 San Francisco, I will use my money to buy it. And some of this stuff that you see out here, that rifle team from 1870 from the 1st California Infantry, the guy didn't know what he had. I got it for $50. He said, old picture, funny looking people. And my search engine caught it. So this is troopers of the 1st California Cavalry Squadron. We don't know which troop in the ruins. This is the medical, they call them sanitary detachments, but they were the medical detachments of the 7th California Infantry from Los Angeles. They were brought up. And you see where a rifle unit would have stacked arms, they got stacked stretchers. This is the Gow Street Armory. This is where the artillery regiment in San Francisco was headquartered. Now you can tell the difference in the uniforms. The National Guard was still wearing the Indian War era dark blue shirt, medium blue pants, leggings, and the olive drab campaign hat. This guy here is wearing khaki. He's regular Army from the Presidio. So when you're looking at pictures of the earthquake, if you're trying to figure out who's who, if they're wearing khaki, they're most likely regular Army from the Presidio. If they're wearing blue, they're National Guard, but we have no clue which regiment because everyone went to San Francisco. California had its own Navy. Initially, it was formed as the Naval Battalion of the National Guard. They reported to the Adjutant General, but that's about as far as they went because the Army didn't want to account for sailors. The Navy, on the other hand, all of a sudden got real interested because they had no Navy reserve. So all the states that bordered, that were on the Mississippi or Missouri River formed naval militias. And it's still in the law. Right now, the only one left is New York. So when you join the Navy Reserve in New York, they stick an extra piece of paper in your enlistment packet that you swear an oath to the governor of New York, and the governor can call up the Naval Reserve in New York. So when they're having all the snow blizzards and stuff, don't be surprised if there's a Marine Corps bulldozer moving snow or a Navy boat or even a Coast Guard Reserve boat. California's naval militia got mobilized for World War I. It went away. Never came back. And this is a type of ship. This is the USS Wyoming. This is a monitor for shallow, big guns on a small deck, one set. They were supposed to be used in coastal or riverine warfare. So these are probably 8-inch guns, 2 8-inch guns on this one ship. That was its only armament. It was just supposed to park itself and lob shells. We had 2 of these. At one time, we had 5 over varying periods of the first generation destroyers, which they called torpedo boat destroyers. This was the first generation where today we have the Arleigh Burke destroyers. Every ship we had during the 1906 earthquake parked themselves on the Embarcadero and turned their pumps because the water system was destroyed. We had about 5, naval militia had about 4 ships that they parked on the Embarcadero, and they used their pumps to fight fires. The Mission Street Armory, that building is still there. We vacated in '74 because the maintenance of having a building that has a creek running through its sub-basements was outrageous. It's better known now as being a studio for a couple of years for interesting movies, that's all I'll say. But now they're developing it into a community center. It doesn't look at all like this, but it does have that castle vibe. It's a gorgeous building. They used to have the roller derbies in San Francisco in there. Bakersfield Army, at this time there was a common architectural theme. You wanted the armories looking as imposing as possible. Troop C, 1st California Cavalry Squadron from Salinas in front of their armory. This, by the way, this unit became the 149th Armor, which was General Beaver's regiment. He's a tanker. This was his unit. It became a cavalry squadron, and then During World War I, it became a machine gun squadron and then a tank company for the National Guard, and we'll talk about them later on. Los Angeles Troop D became Headquarters Troop 40th Division when World War I broke out. This is San Jose's Company M, 5th California Infantry, at their yearly weapons qualification. Now they're at least wearing khaki pants, but they're wearing blue shirts. This is Battery Cranston at Fort Winfield Scott. That's a 8-inch disappearing gun. So the Coast Artillery units actually went out and trained on these to defend San Francisco Bay, which was the second most heavily fortified port in the Western Hemisphere. This is a really cool picture. You know Holt Tractor became Caterpillar. They took their agricultural tractors and sold hundreds to the British and US Army to be artillery prime movers. So you look at pictures of these tracked movers, they were built in Stockton for the British and the US Army. Its competitor, CL Best, that we're going to do you one better. We're going to design a tank. When you look at what actually was deployed, this was on top of another one of their track-laying tanks. This is the 5th California Infantry training with them in 1915, 2 years before we were even in the war. It wasn't accepted by the Army, and they used the two prototypes for bond-raising activities. But still, this is a country that had no history of being that innovative, and you have a company that's building tanks. And the National Guard was the one who trained with them. Here we have the machine gun company of the 7th California in Los Angeles on a recruiting just before World War I. A lot of these units were brought up voluntarily to 100% strength prior to mobilization. One of the other things that changed in the 20th century, in 1903, there was the Militia Act of 1903, often called the Dick Act, after the congressman who authored it. It made the National Guard a reserve of the Army. In exchange for federal weapons, federal pay, federal training, you had to bring yourself up to federal standards. This is where those socially prominent units sort of fell away because they had to get their hands dirty, and they had joint regular Army maneuvers with the National Guard in a Atascadero. So here we have a boxing match of either Army or National Guardsmen. Here's National Guardsmen, cavalrymen at Camp Atascadero in 1908. They had about 5,000 people, and the Army cavalry came from Fort Huachuca, Arizona. So it was a big deal. The Arizona guys loved it. First of all, they got on their horses, and they were going someplace cooler than Fort Huachuca. And if you've ever been in Atascadero, it's not that much cooler. Mexican border crisis. So this is Pancho Villa attacks Columbus, New Mexico. The regular army, the punitive expedition goes into Mexico. The entire National Guard of the United States is called up and placed on the border. For us, it was a short trip going to Nogales. This is Stockton's Battery C, 1st California Field Artillery Battalion. Battery C is an interesting unit because the battery commander by the name of Otto Sandman, Otto later went on to command the regiment. When the 143rd was broken up into separate battalions, there was one colonel excess, so he became the commander of Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, all during World War II. After the war, he ended up retiring as a major general commanding the 49th Gold Miner Division in 1950. This is the camp of Sacramento's 2nd California Infantry in Nogales. So hot canvas tents in the middle of summer in Arizona. I will never complain about Camp Roberts in the summer again. They have air conditioning now. Guard mount for the 1st California Field Artillery in Nogales, again Stockton. The 1st California Cavalry, these might be Sacramentans from B Troop, but this is the 1st California Cavalry Squadron in Nogales. The 5th and 7th California Regiments in Nogales, that's their areas. And there was also a Connecticut regiment co-located with these guys. So this is the 2nd Field Artillery Regiment, the Grizzlies, at Tanforan Racetrack. They were raised right from scratch. There was a call put out where, hey, California Guards, forming a 2nd Field Artillery Regiment. We need volunteers, and they got them. They were at 100% strength within 35 days, all volunteers. This unit also still exists. 1st Battalion, 144th Field Artillery is in Van Nuys. This is them firing their 6-inch guns at Camp Kearney, which is now Marine Corps Air Station Miramar. This is always a cute picture, peeling onions, wearing your gas mask. Okay, Sacramentans. This is Major Wallace Mason. So all the California Guard, all the infantry, artillery, went with the 40th Division when it was formed, which is now the California Division, but had 1 brigade from California, 1 brigade from the rest of the Southwest states. The engineers came from Colorado. So what do you do with the engineer battalion, this excess engineer battalion that's in California? Well, you pair it up with a South Carolina engineer battalion to form the 117th Engineers, and it was assigned to the multi-state 42nd Division. Douglas MacArthur was one of the brigade commanders. Wallace Mason commanded the Californians in the 2nd Battalion. Again, the regimental commander was a South Carolinian. Well, the 40th Division from California was used for providing replacements to fill casualties. The 42nd Division was one of the assault divisions. They were the ones crossing no man's land. And the engineers had to go in first to clear obstacles. Wallace Mason commanded that battalion, and the Californians performed in such a manner that the regimental commander, who was a South Carolinian, sent the colors of the regiment to California. Again, they're in the state archives. Now, Wallace Mason is an important person in Sacramento history. He commanded the 184th Infantry that put down the Folsom Prison riot. He was the commander of the National Guard forces that responded to the dock strike in San Francisco in 1934. How many people have ever been to All Saints Church in Land Park? When you enter the church, if you look to the left, you will see a stained glass window honoring the 184th Infantry Regiment. General Mason commanded that regiment. And after the regiment came back from World War II, he had that made and installed at All Saints Episcopal Church. So there's a Sacramento connection to our history. When the National Guard went away, it left the state with no militia to handle the usual floods, fires, riots, whatever. So they formed the California Home Guard, which was 100 companies, mostly very poorly equipped, very poorly trained, but some were pretty good. This was the 90th in San Francisco. One of the units was very well equipped. It was the 54th Company, also called the Lasky Rifles, which was made up of studio technicians of the Lasky movie studios. Its commander was Cecil B. DeMille. His brother William was the first sergeant. Their uniforms were made by the costume department. Their weapons, all Krag Jorgensens, which were of Spanish-American War, were provided by the prop department. They were functioning weapons. We don't know if they wore the gray uniform, which was what the California regulations said, so they wouldn't be confused for Army, or if they do what every other unit did, wore the green anyway. Between the wars, the lessons learned were taken seriously. Buster Keaton, the silent movie comedian, was a veteran of the California's 159th Infantry that fought in World War I. And here he's being made an honorary captain in the 160th Infantry in Los Angeles. Buster Keaton, along with a lot of other Hollywood actors, would later serve in the World War II California State Guard. In 1924, we got our first aviation unit. And of course, they gave them a bunch of old crap, JN4 Jennies, that only lasted 3 years. And here they are getting ready to be burned. This is the Folsom Prison riot. You obviously see the tower in the background. The phone calls went out to every movie theater, stopped the movies, and said, all National Guardsmen report to your armory, you're being called up. The warden was killed, so they showed up. They even brought a tank from Salinas. The 115th Observation Squadron buzzed the prison yard with their biplanes, and they were pointing the camera guns at them, and the inmates thought those were real guns, but they were cameras. But when you're in a prison riot, then all of a sudden on the yard you see over 1,000 National Guardsmen forming up around you, and a battalion of them go in with fixed bayonets, and I'm not talking about the wimpy 12-inch ones we have today. These were the 18-inch ones on the end of a Springfield. Needless to say, the National Guard, they surrendered because they didn't want to get in that fight. In 1927, they started constructing Camp San Luis Obispo. At that time, it was just called National Guard Training Camp. This is where I'm from, and so I have a special attachment to this installation. I go down there once a month to work, and we're doing a lot of historical surveys. But here they are. They came in on troop trains, came into the Gold Tree siding, offloaded a regiment. What was really interesting was how to get the horses off for the artillery. A machine gun range, and this is the 1935 Army Day demonstration. This is in Los Angeles. They're firing blanks at the 115th Observation Squadron who are buzzing the field. How many people have been down to the Coliseum? You know that big brick building on the one end? That's the old armory. This is what it looked like on the inside. It's now the California Science Center. The assembly hall floor could hold a full infantry regiment of 1,200. Again, more aircraft at Camp San Luis Obispo. You got Cerro Maldo and Cerro Shumash in the background. That's the parade ground / airfield. The 115th flying over Mount Whitney. That's our air guard, early air guard. All the mess halls for an infantry regiment. This is now the west facility of the California Men's Colony. Okay, here we have Otto Sandman again, leading his regiment. The Army's artillery was still horse-drawn until 1936. Okay, here we are at the dock strike in 34. Again, 2 tanks from Salinas. Field mess, these were horse-drawn kitchens. Soldiers have to eat. Machine gun team on the Embarcadero. This gives you an idea of Camp Miriam, which in 1937, the camp at San Luis Obispo was named. And they could hold a full brigade and plus an artillery battalion, and they could run aerial operations off the parade field. So there was 4 weeks that this camp was active, 1 brigade for 2 weeks, and then the 2nd brigade coming in right after them. In 1937, people are starting to see there's going to be a problem coming over the horizon. So there was a series of exercises with the Army and the Army National Guard. 4th Army, which was California, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Nevada, had a series of war games either at Fort Lewis or in San Luis Obispo County. The battle box, as we call it, was basically the entire western half of San Luis Obispo County. World War II, 251st Coast Artillery mobilizing at Camp Seaside, which is the Ventura County Fairgrounds, in 1940, which was 6 months before the rest of the National Guard. There's a legend that there was a coin toss between the 250th from California and the 200th that went to Manila. The 250th, they said the 250th won the coin toss to go to Manila because that was the exotic Far East. Unfortunately, that regiment never came back, or very few of them came back. Again, the first 3 people killed in World War II were 3 members of this unit. Here they are at Camp Malacoa on Barber's Point on Oahu, training with their World War I era 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. Camp San Luis Obispo, the National Guard camp, went from 5,000 acres to almost 20,000 acres. They built Santa Margarita Lake to provide water. And in March 1941, the 40th Division mobilized. They had to get from a strength of 9,000 to a strength of 16,000 during this mobilization. And with the draft going on, they were training up all these units. The National Guardsmen were all of a sudden flooded with new trainees. But by having those National Guardsmen who had all this experience, a lot of them from World War I, they were able to train these trainees. So the National Guard units were actually better trained than the regular Army units that were being formed with just draftees. And that building right there is my Museum Support Center South, one of 2 warehouses that I have at Camp San Luis Obispo. But this is what it looked like. This is just part of it. Tent City. The only semi-permanent buildings were latrines and kitchens. This was the Army Day at my alma mater. San Luis Obispo Senior High School, and back then, and junior college. Cavalry troop on Highway 1 up near San Simeon. This again, they were having massive exercises between Fort Ord, Hunter Liggett, and San Luis Obispo. And Camp Roberts was a basic training, so they didn't have maneuvers there. This is the 144th Field Artillery at Fort Lewis, the Grizzlies. Officers in the front, probably about 800 soldiers. This is the 160th Infantry mobilizing at the Coliseum. Of course, you're out there having field mess, and it starts to rain. If it ain't raining, it ain't training. And this is the 160th at Fort Lewis later in 1942. That's about 2,200 men. That's 1/3 of your fighting force in an infantry division. And the 160th landing on Guadalcanal. They followed up after the Marines and relieved the Marines and continued mopping up Japanese resistance. This is Sacramento's 184th Infantry Regiment landing on Beach Red 1 in Kwajalein. Military historians consider this the best amphibious operation conducted by the Americans. Everything went right. The naval gunfire destroyed all the fortifications, and the Japanese had this since World War I. It was given to the Japanese. This is formerly a German territory in the Pacific. The Japanese took control of it, and they had 20 years to build fortifications. And the Navy was able to destroy them, which made the 184th, commanded by our Sacramento dentist, to successfully assault the beach. And the western half of Kwajalein was the 184th. The right side of the island was the 32nd from the 7th Division with another regiment in reserve in case things went wrong, which they didn't. This is a good picture of a Browning automatic rifleman from Sacramento's 184th Infantry on Okinawa. Look how long that battle lasted, from March to September. And the only reason it stopped was they dropped the atomic bomb. Okinawa was sort of like the Sicily of Japan. The Japanese didn't like them. They considered them lower. And if the Okinawans fought for 6 months, what was going to happen when we invaded the home islands? The Battle of Okinawa is what convinced Truman to drop the bomb. Members of the 184th with a couple of Japanese light tanks. Here they are with a captured 75 millimeter field gun, which we have in our collection and is going to San Luis Obispo to be displayed. Most of the people think that the California National Guard fought in the Pacific. One regiment went east. The 144th Field Artillery, which is broken up into two separate field artillery battalions. This is B Battery 981st Field Artillery from Santa Maria that landed on Utah Beach on 6th of June, 1944. Granted, it's in the afternoon when hostilities had ceased, or at least active hostilities. So they were able to offload off the LSTs relatively peaceful, but they landed on D-Day. The rest of the battalion landed in the following morning. Most of the troops fought in the Pacific in the 40th. Here we have one of the cavalry reconnaissance troop vehicles. This is the raising of the American flag on Storm King Mountain. Every year, the Filipinos from Banban, which is the major city in that area, recreate this. They get a flag attached to a shovel, and they raise the American flag over Storm King Mountain. These guys are from the 185th Infantry, headquartered in Fresno. The current 185th, their call sign is Storm King. So history teaching modern soldiers about their heritage. If you go to Banban, in the middle of their town center, is a statue to California's 40th Infantry Division, because they liberated Banban from the Japanese. And here's Sacramento and Roy Green meeting with the Japanese surrender party prior to receiving their formal surrender. Again, another Sacramentan who made a difference. Unfortunately, someone smoked in bed, and in December 1945, the worst time to be in Korea, someone burned the barracks down. Okay, so one of the things that happened was the National Guard left. What do we have? They formed the California State Guard, which is still active today. I'm a member of the State Guard now. I'm retired from the Army, and I serve the state still in a state status. What was really interesting, unlike other states, this was not a segregated force. We have an African Americans here. They had a full infantry regiment in Los Angeles. There were medical units that were primarily women. Our first women in the military department were state guardsmen during World War II. This is at the Santa Anita racetrack. This is state guardsmen guarding the Embarcadero right after Pearl Harbor, guarding the Golden Gate Bridge sometime in 1941. We had 10 observation squadrons. This predated the Civil Air Patrol by 8 months. So this is at the National Guard Aerodrome at Griffith Park in Los Angeles. And these were all private pilots who donated the use of their airplanes, very much like the Civil Air Patrol does today. San Diego, armed with shotguns. I guess they were thinking about drones someday being developed. Prepare on a training exercise for anti-invasion training. Now, you gotta remember, what was it like in California in 1942, early 1942? The Pacific Fleet is sitting at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. During Christmas week, the Imperial Japanese Navy showed up off the coast, started sinking ships. 2 months later, in February, they showed up again and shelled Santa Barbara, or Goleta, fired 18 rounds, spent hundreds of thousands of yen, and did tens of dollars of damage. Ship going up and down, not real accurate. They missed the oil pier. The one that did hit was a dud. Punched a hole, did $10 worth of damage. All the damage was corrected by a guy with a tractor dragging a blade and filling in the holes. But it caused a panic, which led to the incarceration of the Japanese in California and the West Coast. People were convinced the next action would be Japanese troops landing at Santa Monica. Okay, Korean War. California and Oklahoma were the only two states that sent a division-sized element to Korea. Other states had their divisions called up, but they either backfilled or reinforced Europe. But California first went to Japan for 3 months to get ready to deploy to Korea. We also sent an Air Guard fighter bomber squadron from Ontario. If you go to any military in the field today, this scene has been constant since the Civil War. And if you talk to guys who served in the Gulf, it's the same thing. Doing your laundry in your quarters, hanging it up over the heater. This is something my dad told me about. He fought in Korea. He liked Korea. It was warmer than South Dakota in the winter. But he met my mom when he was going through advanced training at Camp San Luis Obispo. He says, I'm not going back to either. I'm going back to California. I got someone waiting for me. Never had to shovel snow again in his life. Cold War, we were still flying Mustangs. This is at Hayward Air National Guard Base. We also flew B-26 bombers. This is at Van Nuys Air Guard Base. This unit is constantly known as the Hollywood Guard, ever since they were at Griffith Park across from Burbank. During the 60s and 70s, a lot of actors joined. Rayford Johnson was in the Air Police Squadron. Jerry Mathers, the Beaver, was in the Air Police Squadron. There was actors in the firefighting unit. Jack Nicholson was a firefighter on the flight line. And they keep bringing that up. They have the Hollywood Guard all over Channel Islands Air National Guard Base. In 1958, we started taking over a lot of the full-time missile air defense for California. Here we are, we're taking over a missile battery at Fort MacArthur. Watch riots. This gentleman driving it, his name is John Jackson. I know him. He used to be the sergeant major here. He's retired from the LA Sheriff's Department. They had to protect the firefighters. That was one of their main missions from snipers. Very similar to what we saw in the 91 riots, very similar to what we saw in the Rodney King riots. We provided most of the air defense for the West Coast. We still do. The 144th Fighter Wing is getting the new F-15EXs. They regularly intercept Russian Bear bombers that fly down from Siberia along the west coast of North America. And when they cross the California state line, the fighter squadron from Oregon passes them. They catch them off of Canada. They escort them down to the California border where the 144th out of Fresno picks up the patrols. Here we have a simulated Bear bomber interception with a B-52 playing a Bear bomber. This is the battery in Berkeley. The 3 launch points are oriented west. The other 3 are oriented north. So when the National Guard took that battery over, they didn't have the budget. The The regular Army had guys out, had a landscape contract to keep the grass down. We had sheep. There was a fence between the Army and the National Guard because, God forbid, we contaminate their missiles. One night, there's a Bear bomber making its run down the West Coast, and the duty battery was our California National Guard. So what happened was, this is at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's Berkeley, it's cold. Those missiles were sitting in underground magazines heated. Where do you think the sheep went? On top of the doors of the launch of the batteries. So when they punched the button to drop the doors, it rained sheep. You can't fire missiles when there's sheep in the magazine. It doesn't work. Quick, get the command post, tell them we're out of business. We got to clean up all these sheep out of here. Needless to say, they were able to transfer it to another battery. 92 Los Angeles riots. It was the first time a National Guardsman took command. Insurrection was declared. The 7th Infantry Division sent a brigade. The Marine Regiment Division at Camp Pendleton sent a regiment. And it was all placed under the command of a National Guardsman. First time a National Guardsman in a Title 32 status commanded regular Army and regular Marine Corps troops. The guy who led that is a guy who lives up, who's a good friend of mine named Jim Delk, who is commander of the 40th Infantry Division. He wrote the book, the definitive book on the history of the military response to the Rodney King riots. I was down there at a logistical supply point in Compton. There were some interesting nights in Compton at the time. But what was really nice is the people who lived in our neighborhood, in that neighborhood, were the families that had been there forever. I actually had to ask them to stop bringing us cookies because we were gaining weight. We don't get a lot of exercise running gas pumps. In the 91 war, this is my old unit, the 1113th Transportation Company from the Meadowview Armory. This was a line haul unit. They had 40-foot flatbeds, and that's all they did was go down Tap Line Row, back and forth for 6 months, hauling supplies. Margarita Perez commanded a 4-person transportation movement control team that was out in the middle of the desert. Their job was to, as a convoy came past, to provide them with updated information and tell them, make a right, make a left, go straight ahead. So they're out there in the middle of the desert, and all of a sudden, Iraqis started showing with their one saved white t-shirt. Every Iraqi soldier kept a white, pristine white t-shirt for this reason, to surrender to the Americans. She ended up being credited with capturing over 150 Iraqi soldiers. Now, Margarita, I was her platoon sergeant in the 1113th. She was a correctional officer at Folsom Prison. By this time, she's a correctional sergeant. And by, the game telephone, one person tells one person, it got to the main yard at Folsom Prison that Margarita Perez personally killed over 100 Iraqi soldiers, and those inmates couldn't put enough distance between them and this 5'1" lieutenant. She later went on to be retire as a lieutenant and was on the California Parole Board. Very good officer. Northridge earthquake, again, doing what we do best, emergency response, preventing looting. I forgot to mention Loma Prieta. I was heavily involved in that one. I was the logistics NCO for this headquarters during that, and the amount of movement of material and services that we managed to transport, anti-looting patrols, medical support, and it lasted well beyond the earthquake. Those communities above Santa Cruz, those small little communities, someone in their infinite wisdom decided to put the water line and the sewage line in the same trench. Those people were living off with Army latrine, shower points, tents, with Army laundry units, with Army water purification units for 6 months after the earthquake. September 11th, Defense of the Homeland, which is Operation Noble Eagle, still going on. We did a Kosovo rotation. We've done Bosnia, for peacekeeping missions. We ran detention operations at Guantanamo Bay for a year. This is the 1st Squadron, Charlie Troop, 1st Squadron, 18th Cavalry from Ontario, and also combat operations in Iraq. The hardest hit unit was our Sacramento Valley's 1st Battalion, 184th Infantry. You've all heard of Fallujah. The Marines were the hammer, the 184th was the anvil. So as all these insurgents are coming out trying to get ahead of the Marines, they ran into the 184th, and they were the anvil that the Marines were pounding them on. The highest ranking officer killed in the Iraq War was the battalion commander of the 1st Battalion, 184th Infantry. And today, so this is an F-15C, which we will be getting here to display within the next year. This is our 129th Rescue Wing. If you're on a ship that's 800 miles out to sea and you had a stroke like what happened last week, it's not the Coast Guard coming for you. It's not the Navy that's coming for you. It's the 129th Rescue Wing out of Moffett Field. They're coming for you. This is a system that we developed in California. It's called MAFS, Military Airborne Firefighting System. Now it's very widespread in the Air Force, Air National Guard, Air Force Reserve. What it is they put a tank and distribution system in the cargo bay of a C-130. And this is the latest model C-130J delivering fire retardant. This is out of Channel Islands. We also have an attack squadron that flies unmanned aerial vehicles. In peacetime, we use them to track fires. You can fly these into any forest fire and you don't have to worry about the pilot. And I've heard we're getting one of these for here too. And then we have the Army Guard Aviation. We have the CH-47 Chinook 2 years ago during the Camp Fire. This has seating for 33. A helicopter like this and a Black Hawk, which is only meant to carry 11 soldiers. They put 25 into the Black Hawk and 130 people into a Chinook. It flew okay because the Chinook can lift 25,000 pounds. It was just very uncomfortable if the people weren't complaining because they were standing in the water so they wouldn't burn. All of a sudden, this big Chinook twin rotor helicopter comes in wearing night vision devices. You know, the Black Hawk was guiding them in because the pilots could barely see. But they got in there and got the people out in 3 lifts. We did a lot of training in Iraq. The 40th Infantry Division Headquarters Battalion just got back from Kuwait. The 115th Support Group Headquarters in Roseville is leaving tomorrow for Kuwait. State Guard doing security at Joint Forces Base. We have the California Cadet Corps, which predates ROTC by 6 years. I'm an alumni of that at San Luis High School, a very successful leadership program that the military department runs. And that completes, I hope I don't see anyone snoring, so I guess I kept everyone's interested.